Hey, folks, greetings from the Offensive Security Group here at Security 360, coming at you with a new episode of the Cyber Threat Perspective. You've got Mr. Tyler here, as well as myself, Brad. And today we're going to rehash a topic from, I don't know, 50, 60, 70 episodes ago. We're going to talk about external pen testing and kind of, what that looks like from our perspective, right? What does a day in the life of an external pen tester look like? And, what does that mean for everybody else, right? So we're going to kind of get into that. So Tyler, you've been doing external pen testing for years. I have as well. And so it's probably the most common type of pen testing. I guess we should start out right and just talk about like what the heck is an external pen test. So what is your thoughts like at a high level?
External pen testing is pen testing on external assets of a company. Can include cloud resources, SaaS, external IP ranges, anything being utilized outside the internal network. Really is
Yeah.
what I think an external encompasses.
Yep. No, I agree with that. And the approach is from like an external threat actor, right? So let's say that you are a US manufacturing company and China decides you have some, critical stuff that they want, maybe it's like proprietary information, they're going to try to hack into your network. That's basically what we're doing. We're coming at you like a nation state threat actor, and just trying to figure out how, and we're answering the question, right? How would I get into your environment? And I think it's important to understand that that's the question that we're asking, not how many vulnerabilities can I find in your environment? Because those are two separate questions. One of those is a vulnerability assessment or
Mhm.
vulnerability scan. The other one is a penetration test, and they are different. But I think people commonly confuse the two. Um, and so I think it's just important to figure that out. Like that's our mindset. We're not trying to like Pokemon as many vulnerabilities as we can, right?
Yeah, I
We
feel
just
like
want to
we
find ways.
do we
Yeah.
do search for vulnerabilities, but it's purpose based. The vulnerabilities we're
Yeah.
looking for are vulnerabilities that are going to cause, impact or initial access into your environment. So we have a more specified focus than some of your vulnerability scanning tools like Nessus, because Nessus isn't checking for initial access. It's
Right.
doing, an inch deep, mile wide scan of every vulnerability ever.
Yep. Yeah, and a lot of times, Nessus is not looking at things like exploitability, even though that is a metric in the Nessus tool, but they're not looking necessarily at like downstream impact, right? And I don't know what your thoughts are, but in most of the time when we gain initial access from an external penetration test, my experience has been it is a culmination of multiple vulnerabilities that are stacked to create a condition where we can gain access.
Mm.
It's very rarely like, oh, we found this RCE for this service you're
Mhm.
running, and we're automatically root on your box, right? That's not how it works. So what are your like actually, before we get into that, I'm getting ahead of myself, dude. Let's roll it back for a second, right? Because I get excited. This is a fun topic. Um, what are you doing to prepare from your perspective for an external pen test? Like, what is your process? How do the customer come into play with that? Like, with the goal of like just giving to people kind of like what it feels like.
Yeah, so start of engagement, setting expectations with the client of what the pen test entails, and then getting scoping information is your absolute first part.
Yeah.
Um, we can skip ahead to day one of the engagement, communications with client. You've already done up until this point. We're overly communicative. So the
Hmm.
morning that we start day one, we're also communicating. And then I feel like the second thing I do is get my organization structure straight. So I have a template, file structure template for my external pen tests that I just paste and then put my client name on, and then, all my tool outputs go in there, and then all my data from the pen test also goes in there in an organized fashion so that anytime I need to pull output from a tool for a question I need to answer for a vulnerability over here, I can do that because I know where everything's at.
I was going to ask. So you mentioned organization, and it sounds like that's really important to the success of an engagement. Why? Like, why is being like organized and structured so important?
Well, at any point, I'll have 50 different screenshots. I'll have 30 different tool outputs. I'll have 6 different terminals up. I'll have 18 different text files. So
Yeah.
it gets really taxing if you have no organization because you're trying to find a needle in a haystack. So
Right.
to avoid that, having organization and correct file structure is pivotal. Otherwise, you're going to have all these vulnerabilities and no clue how to report them because you can't find your information.
Yeah. I completely agree with that. And that's been my experience as well. When I first started pen testing, I was disorganized. I didn't have a system, if you will. And I think every
Mhm.
pen tester I've ever met, has their own system, if you will,
Yeah.
like the way that the way they name their folders. Though like I think Darius on our team turned us all onto Obsidian at one point,
Yep.
and we're all just absolutely loving using that as a organizational method. For those of you who don't know, it's a markdown format text editor. That's it, man. But it lets you have folder structures, and so we could do a whole episode probably on like tips and tricks of how to use
Yeah,
Obsidian because
Obsidian's really
we're
nice.
we're deep in the Kool-Aid on that, right? But yeah, man. So like, let's say for example, let's go back to what we first talked about. We're stringing vulnerabilities together to create a condition that allows us to get access into your environment. If we're not tracking each and every one of those vulnerabilities in a meaningful way that we can understand and we can trace those things back, we could have initial access and not even freaking know it because we're not keeping track of all the things that we find. And so and then historically, like you mentioned too, where I can go back and look at things.
Mhm.
Dude, we get those questions all the time, and we've actually learned some pretty big lessons on organization and detail throughout our time here at Security 360. And one of those being you got to document and screenshot flipping everything.
Yes, you do.
Because yeah, dude, because they'll come back with some wild out of the blue question, and you're like, man, I don't know, dude. And now the condition of the system has changed. You can't go back in time and get it. So you got to kind of hope you do, that you have it somewhere and it's organized and you can find it. Because I mean,
Mhm.
we're generating like gigs upon gigs of data
Yeah.
through a normal pen test, right? Like think about like a 5 day, like one of the bigger ones, like
I mean, your
hundreds
burp
of
data
files.
file is gonna be
Oh yeah,
massive
multiple gigs
alone.
by itself, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, I mean, to your point, I think, if there's one thing to take away from our side, it's like, man, you really have to be structured. It's a reason that we have such a detailed process that we follow. And it doesn't mean we have to do absolutely everything or that we can't skip around a little bit, but like we're checking off everything that we do. Um, it's like a pre-combat checklist, right? Like when you're going to go into war, like you are like, hey, dude, do I have batteries for my stuff? Right? How many liters of water is in my kit? Same thing with pen testing. We're building out this really strict structure so that we kind of know how things are going to fly later.
Yeah, and as an example for why it's so important for note keeping, even not for documentation, but in lieu of you need to know later in engagement, okay, I got initial access via my password spray. What all login pages do I have?
Right.
If you don't have a host file that's detailed that you've in-mapped, that you know, okay, these are all web hosts that have login pages for either customers or employees at this organization. If you don't have that structure, you may miss initial access on an application that's lacking MFA or other
Yep.
conditions because you didn't take note of it.
Absolutely agree. Yeah, and that's another thing that I think is really important. And we haven't even gotten into like doing the pen test work yet,
Yeah.
right? We're like 10 minutes into the episode and we're talking about planning, but you get later in this process and I think this is universal for most technical fields, but the further you get away from the time that you see something, the less apt you are to remember it. And so by day 4, day 5 of an external pen test, you may have found a clue on day 1 or day 2 that slips your mind, and those two things together become important. And so you really have to, like you said, keep track of it. Those login pages, like the first thing that came to my mind was like password reuse,
Mhm.
right? Like we're going to go off the dark web, scrape off compromised credentials, and then day 2, day 3, you find a login page, and if you don't document that page when it comes to exploitation, and we start stuffing credentials, you miss a page. You literally just miss something that a threat actor may not, and that is bad guys go to have the same access to the dark web we do, and bad guys have access to those forums. So then they go stuff that they get into the environment, the week after your pen test, and you look like a fool. So yeah, it's hugely important to be organized and methodical, and I would even argue consistent.
Yep.
Right, the same way that you do it every single time will keep you from missing stuff.
Yes, it will.
Um,
Yeah, and
all right.
documenting that stuff is also important because, talking back to authentication, if client is using 10 different cloud applications that are all SSO'd back to Microsoft.
Hmm.
Well, if you only communicate that 9 of those apps are SSO'd back and that other one doesn't get MFA'd, you've essentially missed a gap there.
Yeah.
Um, so having documentation, knowing everything about all the apps that you come across is super
Hmm.
important. I feel like
Yeah.
that's something I do. Have detailed host notes, just a little one-liner. What is this page? What is it responsible for? And that keys
Hmm.
me in later in the engagement, with those other notes that I get.
Yep. Absolutely. So we actually, like, side note, we have teamed up with our local Hack the Box chapter, and I'm going to teach a 2-hour class on an introduction to like network level pen testing. And that's one of the topics is like the way that you structure your notes is absolutely the difference between success and failure. Right. And the same goes for CTF, capture the flag. And that's really kind of what we're orienting this towards. People
Mhm.
who want to play the game. But it's the same thing, dude. Like the process is the same. The detail is the same. And you miss one thing and you just wasted 6 hours chasing your tail.
Yep.
Um, so yeah, and that's absolutely important. And so, there's a reason we beat on that subject for 10 minutes because it is that freaking important. And you'll understand like the third time you do an external pen test, you're gonna be like, wow, my organization sucks. Because everybody starts out that way, right? And it's okay.
Yeah, the pre-engagement steps, I'd say, are the most pivotal to having a successful engagement. Because if you don't prepare properly, the engagement isn't gonna go well.
Absolutely agree, man. So you're setting yourself up for success.
Correct.
Like you said, your folder structure's built out, your note structure's in place, and then the order that you do. So now let's get into execution a little bit, right? So now we've started. It's Monday morning. We got our third 18th cup of coffee, whatever it is, and we're gonna start doing pen testing. And so, what are some of the first things that you do? Why do you do it that way? Like, how does that? You don't have to go like super detail, but like, what does that
Sure.
initial process look like for you?
Open source intelligence, always. Always, always, always. You don't
Yeah.
know what you're testing until you know who you're testing.
Yep.
Context is important in all types of pen testing. So if I'm testing, healthcare, or if I'm testing law firm, I need to clue into the vector of my client because that's going to dictate what type of SaaS that they're utilizing, like
Mhm.
document management systems for law firms
Yep.
or, healthcare websites for your healthcare vectors. So having that context is important going into things. So open source intelligence on the company, gathering emails, subdomains, all public information that I can with
Yeah.
non-invasive tools.
Yeah. Yeah, and I
Super,
think
super important.
usually, like, for a larger engagement, usually the entirety of day 1, we don't even touch their environment, right? Like, in most cases.
Yeah.
I know we've recently kinda merged active and passive reconnaissance,
Mhm.
into a single thing, and we have reasons for doing it that way, but the OSINT, to your point, hugely important, dude. I did a pen test, man, it's probably been 2 years ago now. Um, the OSINT led to initial access. Like we went straight from OSINT into their environment because we found a LinkedIn page. And I've probably told this story on the podcast before, but we found a LinkedIn page where this dude started with the company in the January previous. And of course, he's a developer. So he puts his GitHub account on his LinkedIn profile. Cause I mean, who's not going to want to brag about the stuff they did, right?
Right.
We go out to GitHub, we pull everything down and we parse it through and we find AWS creds, right? Like an application access key, which we then pivot straight into their AWS environment. And we're like, boom, done. We never even our first touch of your network was inside.
Yeah, that's
And that's
scary. That is
horrifying, right?
scary.
So yeah, it just underscores the importance of that OSINT that you're talking about because I don't think a lot of people fully grasp the amount of information that is publicly available about companies, about the people that work there, about the technologies that are in use. Like I can go look at your dice.com job posting and tell that you're using MS SQL, you're programming your apps in C sharp, and you need somebody who's really skilled in these particular functions, right? And so
Mhm.
now I already know like what I want to target in your environment. And if I'm going to drop a payload, it's going to be a C sharp web shell, right? So we can build our attacks around just what we learned in OSINT. You know,
Yeah, and it's also pivotal for gathering the information for an attack footprint later. The better OSINT you do, the likelihood that you're going to find resources the client didn't know about, or maybe
yeah,
they're old and the client forgot about. We find that all the time we do
yeah,
OSINT because we're so comprehensive in what we grab.
yeah,
Just because we don't wanna miss things and we want the client to figure, "Hey, we didn't know that was out there. That's a huge
yeah,
find." We get that all the time,
all
and
the
that's
time.
probably the most important, I guess, that's the value add from the pen test really is, like, you find assets that have been sitting out there for 6 years that are unpatched and lead to your environment. That's more common than you think.
It is. It is. It's scary, dude. We were actually I just got off the phone today talking with a client about a 13-year-old and a 12-year-old vulnerability that almost directly led to our internal pen tester getting system access on their database cluster.
Wow.
So like, you know what I mean? So we're finding this stuff like you said. If you don't know the system's there, how you patching it, dude? How are you how
Mhm.
are you checking that thing to make sure it's squared away? And I'll add something to that too. Talking about OSINT, right? The quality of your OSINT is going to directly impact the quality of your work downstream because if you miss something, if there is a DNS name that you missed, then it doesn't get rolled into active reconnaissance. It doesn't get rolled into vulnerability discovery. So all of those downstream processes that we have in place that are so important don't occur because we missed something during during that initial OSINT research.
Mhm.
So it is probably, maybe even arguably, the most important thing that we do
I would say it
is the
is
very
because
first
it's
thing.
that
Yeah.
domino effect. This
Right.
information goes into that, which goes into that, which leads to this. That's
Mhm.
kinda your OSINT's the beginning of everything. So second to pre-engagement, I feel like we're really pre-engagement's the start of the engagement, the most important, OSINT's the
Yep.
second part, the second most important. So
Yeah, completely agree with that. So, all right, so we're moving from OSINT, what we would consider to be passive reconnaissance, over into active reconnaissance. So, what does that look like for you? I'm assuming you're just kind of rolling everything you found into that next phase or something similar, right?
yeah, active reconnaissance is where you're going to get a lot of your valuable information back. So, open ports, version information, you're going to find web servers, authentication, endpoints,
Yeah.
web apps, all this different stuff. I'd say one of the most important skills as a pen tester that has benefited me in exploiting and finding information out about those is being able to Google. Because if I get an InMap result
It
back,
sounds so simple, man.
it does, but it is one of the most complex things to be able to find the information that you wanna find in a
Yeah.
quick manner,
Yep.
and it's the information that you need. Because
Right.
Google has petabytes of data on it. So, if you don't know what you're searching for, you don't know how to keyword for the data that you want, you're never gonna find it.
Right.
So, being
Yeah.
able to do that, being able to say, "Okay, I've got OpenSSH version 8. Is this out of date? Does this have vulnerabilities? Yes. Okay, what are the vulnerabilities?" And then you stack that process, and now you've got RCE on OpenSSH because you know how to Google. So,
Yep.
simple things like that go so, so far.
They do. Yeah. Just knowing how to leverage resources, right? Like exploit DB, for example, is cool. And if in any like online manual that you read and that takes you through like the Metasploit like all the certification exams and stuff.
Mhm.
They're like, oh, dude, yeah, you just roll like Nmap straight into exploit DB and then you pipe that into Metasploit and you're in. Yeah, it's not how any of that works, dude.
Yeah,
Doesn't
like
work that way at all.
mm-mm.
And
That's how it
you
works on TV, but this is real life, so
yeah, yeah, that might work in your like DEF CON CTF, right? In the real world, that's not how any of this stuff works. That meme comes to mind from, I think it was like the Geico commercial or something. Um, but yeah, so one other thing I'll mention too, the counterpoint, and I want to talk about AI for just a minute because I think it's relative, or it's relatively important what we're talking about. The counterpoint to that is like, I don't need to know how to Google, I'll just ask AI. And
I have a
that will
counterpoint to your
absolutely,
counterpoint.
I figured you would, right? I do too. But I can guarantee you there are some listeners out there right now who are like, yeah, I don't need to know that, dude. I'm just gonna be like, yo, what RCEs exist for blah 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 blah, right?
Mhm.
And the problem that you have there is AI is not there yet, right? It may give you some information. It's not always correct. It's not always comprehensive. And so you're going to ask a pointed question. It's going to give you a pointed answer. And there are all of these other nuances that exist out there that you're going to miss because you didn't do the research yourself. So what is your counterpoint and how far off am I?
If you don't know what you're searching for, you don't know if the information that you got is correct or not.
Absolutely.
So if you don't know what remote code execution does, and ChatGPT tells you that it has RCE, you're lacking context to what that vulnerability is and how to actually exploit it.
Yeah.
So ChatGPT is great if you know what you're talking about, but once again, the information might not be relevant. It might be old.
Mhm.
ChatGPT, even though it says it can Google and get the most recent information, it
Mhm.
still lacks capability sometimes.
Yeah.
So
Well, and the most
having
recent information isn't always the best.
correct.
So yeah. So yeah,
So
you're right. There's
you
a
need
there's
that
a lot.
pre-context before you leverage AI, because you have to
Yep.
know what you're doing before you can utilize that third party. Because
Mhm.
AI is not there to tell you how to do everything. We still need to be able to learn and comprehend the information that we're given. So I feel like AI is there as a helper. So if you
Yep.
get stuck on something, it can help you get past that hurdle. But in terms of just giving you everything you need, I would, relying on
Yep.
that's pretty terrifying to
And
me.
and that yeah, I agree, man. That's why that's not even part of our SOPs, you know? And I mean, that's not to say that we don't leverage AI for certain things. Of course we do because it's a value add to just general life, right?
Mhm.
But it is not a core tenet of anything that we do. And that is by design. And so, I would even go so far as to say, like, that's the reason that these AI automated pen testing solutions and services that are coming out right now, they're just not there yet, right? And they may be one day, but for all the reasons that you and I just described, it's not the end all be all. And so, like, I'm not gonna have AI run Nessus or Nmap or whatever, and it like suddenly just do all of the other things that we do,
Mhm.
because a set of human eyes are gonna change things. And it goes back to that same analogy that I always use, right? I can build a website with a hack me button on it, and no scanner or AI is going to understand the context of what that means, and it's going to get missed until a human being lays eyes on it and clicks the button and sees what happens. And so, we still have to put humans in front of this thing.
Yeah,
um
because AI still lacks context.
it does.
So all the information that it grabs, it's not gonna know how to fully exploit something unless it has a full context, and I haven't seen an AI that can do that yet.
I agree.
I know that, who's working on one? Palo Alto is working on an attack framework with AI, but, I mean, even it's pretty heavy under wraps and isn't there yet, so I'd say that
Yep.
our broad solutions like ChatGPT definitely isn't there.
Completely agree, completely agree. So I'm glad we addressed that, because I think that's probably a common question that we might get. So
Now, it is important to know if you need code, there is no better thing to create code for you, not for web apps. ChatGPT will give you vulnerable
they're
code for a web
terrible.
app.
They're
Please do
terrible.
not do that. But if
We've
you
tested
need
it, I
like
promise.
a script written really fast and you know what it needs to do,
Yeah,
ChatGPT can make that really quick and it'll run
yeah,
and it'll be efficient. So
yeah.
leveraging it in that is a great idea.
It is, and there are still limitations even with that, right? Because I've used ChatGPT or other other AI models to
Mm,
to generate code, and it kind of worked, right? And it got me 90% there or 80% there, and then I had to finish it.
yep.
And so I don't recommend people that don't understand how to write code. You don't need to be getting code out of AI,
Yeah.
because you're going to run something that's going to nuke your system or somebody else's, or it's just not going to work. And then you're
Mm.
going to spend 4 or 5 hours trying to troubleshoot it through AI, and it's going to lead you down rabbit holes. So
And I accidentally
even
DDoS the server that you're trying to, enumerate
right.
users from.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's not how you get client retention, man. I'm just saying.
That's true.
So yeah, but yeah, so just to understand, those of you out there who are leaning on that a little bit, just understand its limitations, right? It's just like any other tool. We have tools in our arsenal, if you will, that we understand the limitations of. Like Nessus is absolutely terrible at SSL findings. Nmap is not always perfect when it comes to there are some technologies that will make Nmap perform poorly. So we have to understand our tools. And I think we got the t-shirt, right? Hashtag know your tools.
Mhm. Yep.
AI is just a tool. It's one of 1,000 that we use. And we understand that it's still going to be wrong a lot, right? Um, all right. So let's kind of continue forward. So, how do you, when you're building like an attack package, right? Or whatever you want to call it, what do you formulate that based on? So you've kind of gone through your reconnaissance phase. Now we're wanting to figure out if stuff's vulnerable, and then how we want to attack it. So what does that look like?
It's really if it passes a sniff test for me. Like, I'll be honest, I can look at a web app and tell if it's a bad web app or not.
You
And so
can,
that
yeah,
really keys me in on what I need to attack. So I can look at a web app. If it looks old, it is old. And it's
yeah,
probably running old software and it's probably vulnerable. So that can hone me in.
hmm
I've been pen testing for what, nearly 4 years now. So
hmm
if you're new to pen testing, your sniff test probably isn't gonna be as good.
yep,
So I think even things such as analyzing headers of web apps, getting version information, looking that up, like I'm getting
just
version
looking at
information
the
on everything, like
yeah,
install jQuery libraries, any dependency on that web app that's running, even the backend infrastructure that it's built on. All of that's important context to know, is this worth my time attacking or not?
absolutely.
Because
And that
if
comes with experience, like you said, right?
yes,
Because I'm the same way, dude. I can look at a web app, and if it's leveraging .asp files or .php files, I'm like 80% chance I'm going to hack this app. Like,
yeah,
no question, right? ASP has been around for a very long time, so has PHP. And we can just look at like what is it, the Wapalizer, and
mhm.
and I can tell you pretty confidently one way or the other, like, yeah, I'm going to own this thing. You
Yeah, you
know,
can also go through other tool outputs, and if you see a bunch of default files installed on a server, it's probably because it hasn't been configured with it being externally facing in mind. They just left a
yeah,
bunch of artifacts or remnants on that server, so
yep,
the likelihood that it's being patched and updated and looked at constantly is low.
I
So
agree. Yep.
exploitability on that one probably high, so that one would go on my list.
Yeah, it's kind of like, if you're driving through a neighborhood, right? And you see this one house that's like dilapidated, cars on blocks in the front yard, like pretty sure they don't have a security system installed in that house,
Yep.
right? And same kind of thing in our world. We do exactly the same thing with services. Like if I run up against a host and it's got like 57 ports open, I'm like, whoa, what is this thing?
Yeah.
You know, because in the current ecosystem of like externally facing systems, most systems have one or two ports open, right? They have a purpose.
Mhm.
If you have this like general purpose MySQL, PHP, Apache stack thing, and all this stuff's publicly facing, you know, SNMP v1, and I'm just like, yeah, that's gonna belong to me
Nightmares.
before
Yeah.
dinner time, right? I'm gonna have that thing. So yeah, no, absolutely, man. And that also, you know, just kind of stepping outside the external pen test world for a second, that also tells me like these dudes aren't doing the blocking and tackling that they should be doing from a
Mhm.
security perspective, right? Are they, you know, if we're finding stuff you don't know you have, your asset management needs work, right? And it's not to say that we can't make mistakes and that they can't either, but you can get a feel for the overall maturity of an organization's security program by looking at their external footprint, and you can tell if
Yeah.
they're squared away.
Yeah, there's a few external hardening findings that we're very, very adamant about, and if we see
Right,
organizations lacking all of them, we know that their maturity, just off the cuff, is very low.
right. Yep, I
So,
completely
yeah.
agree with that. All right, so so we've moved to this position where you now have identified systems that you can get into, right? And we don't have to like get into lots of detail about that. But what about post exploitation? Like, let's say you do get initial access into an organization from the outside, which is worst case scenario,
Mhm.
right? That is like super bad.
Yeah.
What do you do?
Call the client.
Yeah, you don't just like keep
Client
going, or
No, 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 never, never. Client dictates next steps always. So if I get initial access into an environment and the client doesn't want it tested, I'm hands off. Because at the end of the day, every vulnerability I find past that, I report. So if there's a bunch of vulnerabilities they already know about inside that system, they don't want them caked into the report, they can tell me no, and I can't
yeah,
really do anything about it. But
yeah,
it's also intrusive testing, so if there's sensitive information on that server, they may just want to kick us out and fix it right then, right there. So it's important to communicate that because a lot of the times if we are calling a client because we got initial access, it's because there's a critical level vulnerability in play, and the client needs to know about that then rather than when the report's delivered.
I agree 100%, right? Because if you can get in, somebody else can too, and there's
Yes.
a very high likelihood that either that's already happened. Because again, we check these, you know, most clients do an external pen test once a year, maybe
Mhm.
twice a year if they're super like cool.
Yeah.
Which means for anywhere between 6 and 12 months, that
That's just
vulnerability's
been
been sitting
sitting
out
out
there.
there.
So
Mhm.
somebody may have found that, and they could theoretically find that between the time that you do and the time that you review the report with the client. And now we are knowledgeable of this condition. We have to tell the client and either fix it, see how far it goes, whatever that looks like. That, like you said, that's totally up to them. I think that's the right approach. And I also think that that dispels a myth about what we do, right? Because I think everybody envisions us. We got like our hoodie on, our
Mhm.
black light, you know, all the lights are off, and we're just doing this like, you know, and then we get into an environment. We're like, oh yeah, dude, I'm totally gonna blah 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 do all these things, and we're like, yeah,
Yep.
no, we're stopping it. We're calling the client. Like, yo, dude, I'm in your stuff. What do you want to do? You know, and I'd say it's probably 50-50, right? We get some clients who are like, go as far as you can, and then we have a lot of other clients who are like, stop. I'm gonna go fix that right now.
Yeah, it
And
also takes the liability off of us because if that's a
right.
deprecated system and I get in there and I poke 2 things and the whole
And it just
system's
falls over.
offline and it was in production, like, that's on me, and
Yeah.
I don't want that at all. So
So, you know, you said something that just now that really you know, piqued up my ears, right? So we do testing in production for external pen tests. That's a really important thing for people to understand. The work that we're doing is on live systems that are critical to the functionality of this company and their ability to do business. And in many cases, like we knock something over, they lose money, like significant amounts of money. And so, yeah, we have to be careful, man. It's the reason we don't run tools like Metasploit. It's the reason we don't run in, you know, intentionally invasive or dangerous tooling. We are very careful about like what switches we use with Nmap because Nmap can take a system down, right? And yeah, so we are testing in a production, but it's not like a web app pen test where we're in like a test or a dev environment and we can, you know, run something like SQL Map, which
Mhm.
will absolutely destroy a flipping system.
Yep.
You run that against a production system that's vulnerable to SQL injection, it can corrupt the database. And if there's no backups, you're done. I know this because I've actually done
Yeah.
this. Like
Speaking
I've
from
done this.
experience here, yep.
Yeah, dude. Yeah. So it only takes one of those engagements for you to be like, oh, maybe I should reevaluate how I'm doing this. So no, I'm really glad you said that.
I think it's also that's a key reason it's important to get the client to communicate any servers that are running deprecated software or on older
Yeah.
versions or just have older components because that's important context for us. Because if I fire up Burp, it's going to send 100,000 requests if it can.
Yeah.
And if you tack that onto an older server, it's just going to die under that load.
Yeah.
So we have to be super careful when we start running enumeration for vulnerabilities on these systems and make sure that we're only targeting systems that can
Yeah.
handle the traffic that we're sending.
Yeah, and we can tune those things down. We can ratchet them up, whatever we need to do. All right, good. So we talked about kind of everything leading up to that. So now let's talk about reporting because we're at 30 minutes. I don't want to go too much longer. Um, tell me about like wrapping the engagement up, right? Like maybe talk a little bit about reporting and what's important there, and then kind of how you close it out.
Yeah, so reporting is kind of a process that we do during the engagement. As the engagement runs, as we find vulnerabilities, I find it important to upload them, to our reporting software as I find them, so I
Hmm.
don't have to keep documentation of them in my notes. I can screenshot the vulnerability, put it in our reporting software, I'm done. So
Yeah.
at the end of the engagement, when you get to, day 5, you're going to export the report, everything's already in there for you. Your
Hmm.
screenshots are in there. So it's an easier process to just export that and have that ready.
I agree. Yeah. And that's one of the ways that we turn the reports around so fast, right? So, like a lot of pen test firms will take weeks to give you a report after an engagement. I've heard of like 6 weeks to like 12 sometimes on generating those reports. They've got to be writing them with like stone tablets or some shit, dude. I have no
Yeah.
idea
I have
because we're
no clue.
we're kicking a report out like 24 hours. You know what I mean? After the end of the engagement, and in most cases, even after peer review, the report is in the hands of the client within 48 hours of the conclusion of the engagement. So yeah, I think that's important. Are there any important aspects of from your approach to reporting that you think that the listeners would want to know?
I
Like any
think
key things
having
or yeah,
detailed information in your report as kind of proof of work is a very
yeah,
big thing that I feel like we've started doing. I feel like showing your work is pivotal in pen testing because at the
mhm,
end of the day, the client has paid me for 5 days of my work, and the client doesn't know if I'm working or not because they can't see my screen. They don't know the
yeah,
commands I'm running. So I feel like it's important to communicate the work that you did. Even if it didn't directly lead to initial access, you can still provide value and say, "Hey, we did this, 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 and this. You guys
I
are
agree.
good. Your security's buttoned up." That gives them the feel good. "Hey, we did good. Here's some proof that we did good." And it also makes you look good because you put more information, more detail, more work into your report.
Yep. Yeah, and I think it's one of the things that differentiates a mature pen testing organization from others. And what I mean by that is there are a lot of pen test firms out there, and I'm not throwing shade on anybody, but there are a lot of firms out there that are not doing thorough pen tests. Right? I just had a meeting about this today. One of our
Yeah.
clients is like, "Yo, here's this report from last year's pen test," and I'm like, "Bro, you didn't get a pen test."
That's a nice vulnerability scan you got there, man.
That's exactly what it was too, and it wasn't even comprehensive because they didn't do OSINT, right? So they basically took the scope, plugged it into Nessus, and then made a report. And I was like, "So what about the other?" And I think literally they scanned 18 sites. The client had 240. So like, holy smokes, dude, right? And so the client gives us those same 18, we find all 240 and review everything, and so hopefully we catch that in the scoping phase because
Mhm.
otherwise it's just you got to be a really big engagement. But
Yep.
the point stands, right? If they're not doing these thorough things, then they're going to miss stuff, man. And if they're just throwing all this through Nessus and Metasploit and using all these easy tools, you're just going to get a bad product, and that's part of the way that we try to differentiate ourselves. And those of you out there that want to be pen testers, you should do this too. Show your work, man. Like Tyler's talking about, that we have like narratives in these reports of like, here's some output from this particular attempt that we did. Here's how your defenses measured up. We even include alerting, right? Like if the client
Mhm.
has an alert that we generated, we want to know about it because, hey, dude, that's a net positive. The vast majority of our pen tests, we don't even get caught. The fact that you were able to detect what we were doing is really cool, and we want to give you kudos for it. So I think all those nuance things that go into these reports make a big difference just in the perception to the client. So they know that we're doing a good job and we're being thorough and that we are interested in, them being successful in this engagement.
Yeah, and I feel like the stigmatism around pen test reports, they're all negative, and that's because most of them are, and I don't feel like that should be it, because at the
Yeah.
end of the day, clients have a lot of positives, and I feel like pen test
Yeah,
reports should reflect those,
I
because
agree.
it's both a test against the client, their security systems, and also their security stack and everything within it. So call out the wins for them because that's
Yeah.
important context in that report. Like, hey, we were able to exploit this, but we got quarantined 6 times and there were 40 different alerts.
Yeah.
That's important because if you just say, "Hey, we hacked you," but you exclude that information, it's
Right.
dishonest.
It is, and these folks, man, like I was a sysadmin, right? Like I was the guy putting up the defensive stuff early in my career, and like I've got an emotional tie to a
Mhm,
lot of the work that I've done, and these organizations are spending millions of dollars, putting hundreds of hours of effort into this, and it's understandable that they're like, "Yo, dude, like in your report, you're like, oh yeah, but I found this one JavaScript library out of date, and it's a critical, and you guys suck." That's not it at all, man. Like you guys did a great job on all of these other things. Here are some opportunities for improvement for you. And that's kind of the tone that I think that, pen test reports should take
mhm.
is like, here's where you guys are winning. Here's where you got some opportunities to do a little bit better.
Yep.
All right, cool. Any kind of wrap up thoughts, man? So that's kind of, the we didn't really talk about like post engagement stuff like retesting and the discussions. And I think that's probably not as big of a thing when it comes to like what we do on a day-to-day basis, but
Mhm.
we might talk about that on another episode. So yeah, close me out, give me some good thoughts, and then I'll wrap us up.
Get an external pen test, have asset management, make sure you're secure. I'd love to do it.
Love it, man. No, absolutely. Yeah. And so, for those of you out there who are listening, we do this podcast and we're not trying to sell you guys anything. So, the biggest win for us is when you guys like, subscribe, and share what we're trying to do. We're really just trying to get the word out about security in general, specifically in the offensive security space, and just have these conversations to educate people. I want everybody out there that is trying to either procure offensive security services or become an offensive security person to be successful. Even if it has nothing to do with us, and that's kind of our mission here. So help us out, rate us, like all that good stuff, whatever platform you're on, and we really appreciate it. And we'll see you guys next week.